So thank you so much for coming out to hear me read and to be in conversation with Julie. I have to, first of all, thank the bookstore and also really thank Julie, whose work I truly admire. I consider myself a humorist as well, and I just I'm honored to share the stage, as it were, with her. So I'll go ahead and talk to you just a tad about Oblivion and sort of how I got the idea for it. I was thinking, when someone passes away who's like a rock musician or something like that, they say that person's gone to the great band in the sky or whatever. So I wondered, what happens to writers? Where do they go? And I decided that they go to, at least the ones who aren't famous, go to the cafe of minor authors. And so I decided to write a kind of memoirish mashup of, well, it's a mashup of memoir and fiction, speculative fiction, that takes place both in this cafe of minor authors and in Prague in 1911 and 1912, and follows the misadventures of the narrator, who's unnamed, which you find out why later in the book, and his sort of frenemy that he knew when he was alive in Chicago in his youth, a poet and antiquarian book dealer named Joseph Wojciech. And Joseph is also his guide to sort of revisiting not his life, but the life of his literary hero, Franz Kafka, in 1911 and 1912, and Kafka's great friend and sort of impresario, Max Brod. But also he discovers early on in the book that his great-grandmother Hannah who he knew as a star of the Yiddish theater in Europe, in Prague, also knew Franz Kafka. And so it follows, in part, it's about that, but it's also about this writer's desire to escape oblivion. He's ambitious even after his death, and he wants to somehow still make his mark, even though he failed to make his mark on Earth. So I'm going to start not at the very beginning. I'll just read for about 10 minutes or so. I'm going to skip around a little bit in the introduction, and just start with the sort of description of the cafe and move on. So he's already met Joseph again. The cafe was crowded and smoke-filled. Not smoke so much as mist. The mist seemed almost a living thing, curling around the ankles of some customers, obscuring entirely the features of others. There was a clamor of voices and spoons, the cafe full of men and women as far as I could see. Still, the place retained a cozy atmosphere, perhaps a result of the mist. A cappuccino sat in front of each of us, foamed perfectly, 2 dark drops dotting the foam where the espresso had flowed through. When I picked up my cup and tasted my coffee, the sensation was unlike any I had ever felt. My lips made no impression on the foam, and nothing liquid entered my mouth. But I still had the sensation of drinking a perfectly brewed cappuccino. Some passing acquaintance, former student, colleague, or friend sat at nearly every table I could see. The afterlife, it seemed, was not unlike the annual Associated Writing Programs conference, full of smart, unfulfilled people such as me. Not all the tables were 2-seaters. Some seated as many as a dozen people, sipping their coffee and chatting amicably. At one such table, I spotted my friend Maudie, who smiled and gave me an animated wave, and I waved back. I had last seen her at the AWP conference years before my death, a year before a heart attack took her. She was one of the sweetest people I had ever met, and we had been conference buddies for nearly 30 years, though we rarely saw one another more often than once a year. Still, I felt some modicum of hope that, at the very least, I now had all the time in the world to catch up with my old friends. I motioned to her with my index finger toggling between us that we should catch up, and she nodded back, her face bright. And then I returned to Joseph, who looked at me in a slightly bemused way. So, where are we then? We're merely in oblivion. Not so terrible. We still have hope. At least we're not Dybbuk's. Even while alive, Joseph had always spoken in riddles, one of the many annoying things about him, including his cigarette habit. I was never good at hiding my annoyance. I nodded this time. Oh, sure, I said. Dybbuk's are no fun at all. You've read Blake? He asked, ignoring or more likely not even registering my mockery. I'd read almost nothing of Blake. All I could remember was the line, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright," but I gave an exasperated sigh as though I had done my dissertation on him. I actually need to reread Blake, Joseph said. He's a comfort and a caution both. So, we're allowed to read here? Yes, of course, he said. You can do almost anything you like here, within reason, as well as outside of reason. You know, the dead can haunt the living. The living can haunt the living. The living can haunt the dead, but the real revelation is this: the dead can haunt the dead. What does that mean? I asked. Well, you'll see, he said in his obscure Joseph fashion, raising a hand, palm outward, towards the multitude of writers in our midst as though serving me something on a platter. What did you mean by hope? I asked. Hope? You said we have hope. Look around you, he said. We're not alone. I considered this and wondered if the company of others truly constituted hope. Hadn't so many of the really great writers struggled in isolation? Could it be said that any of us were not alone? Did the others in this cafe care one whit for anyone but themselves and their dead careers? I took a sip of my never-cooling cappuccino so that I wouldn't burst into ethereal tears. I wanted none of this. It was over, all over, nothing more I could gain or lose in life, and that took some getting used to. Only reflection remained, endless reflection. And what did any insights matter now? Nothing I did or said here would have the same weight as when I had been alive. No weight at all, because there were no choices left. Nothing, anyway, that would affect the future, that would even leave the faintest mark. So much of my writing career had been about hanging on to my dreams of glory. These could be sustaining on occasion, though when they failed to pass, there was the inevitable hard fall from my imagined grace. The way I died was especially regrettable. The worst author death ever. Worse than Richard Farina, who died in a motorcycle crash after a book party for his just-published novel, I've Been Down So Long, It Looks Like Up to Me, which became a bestseller after his death. Worse than Sherwood Anderson, who swallowed a cocktail sword and died of peritonitis. Worse than Tennessee Williams, who choked on a bottle cap. Worse than Frank O'Hara, who was run over by a dune buggy while asleep on the beach on Fire Island. Even worse than Aeschylus, who died when an eagle dropped a turtle on his bald head, mistaking it for a rock to crack open the shell. I was at lunch with my wife when I received an email from my agent telling me that the auction for my new book was in the stratosphere. This is going to change everything for you, she wrote. I hadn't even realized that there was going to be an auction. I gave a little yell and told my wife what my agent had written, then wrote back to her asking who was bidding and how much. 10 minutes later, I received a text from her. I'm so sorry, she wrote. That was meant for another client. No takers on yours, I'm afraid, but don't give up hope yet. That's just what I did. I fell into my dessert, an enormous celebratory slice of pecan pie with French vanilla ice cream, and died of a massive heart attack. I was 62. A fortune teller had told me at the age of 22 that I shouldn't become a writer, and I saw that in the long run she was right, though I had laughed at her at the time. After all, I had just been accepted to the famous Iowa Writers' Workshop. How much more wrong could she be? I thought at the time. But what had all this brought me? A life of small victories and large disappointments, and an afterlife filled with mirrors of myself, all trying to put a good face on our collective obscurity. You look so down. Don't be too hard on yourself. yourself, Joseph said. You had a respectable career, a small circle appreciated you. He produced out of nothing a sketch pad and a piece of charcoal, and he started to draw while looking at me intently. I shook my head and gave him my most baleful look, which made not the slightest impression on him. Illustrations, he said, for your biography. Why would I want a biography, I asked. No one would read it. That's not necessarily so, he said. It might even get you the recognition you think you deserve. Who knows? Recognition? Here? Among the living. The living, I asked. That's impossible. Yes, you're right. It is. So, that doesn't happen. No, he said. I'm afraid not. He drew a decisive line with the charcoal, my jawline, perhaps. It has happened, he added with more deliberation, but it's exceedingly rare. Who? Hold still, he said, rubbing the charcoal back and forth. My hair, I assumed. There have been cases, he said, but you shouldn't. Who? Carl Winterhoven, best-selling author of The Black Hawk Exchange, for instance? The way he said that, daring me not to recognize the name. Oh, I said as though I was impressed and amazed. I had never heard of Carl Winterhoven, best-selling author of The Black Hawk Exchange. So, I take it you've read the Black Hawk series? Joseph asked. Of course, I said. Do you find him derivative of Highsmith, or as Rushdie did in the TLS, or do you consider him his own man, as Chernoff opined in the Post? He let out a long, smoky sigh. He's sort of a hero of mine, he added. Well, you've always had good taste, Joseph, I said. From years of practice, I was an expert at pretending to have read books I hadn't even heard of. But how did he do it? Turn, he said. The other way. I turned. Like this? He nodded. It's complicated. He held my portrait at arm's length and examined it, then tore off the page and tossed it into a pocket of air. Let's try this, he said, and propped his hand beneath his chin. Finger pose. No, I said. Stop it. You're making fun of me. So, let's see. I'm quite the Winterhoven buff. Little known fact. He wrote the vast majority of the Black Hawk series after he passed. Saffron Segovia is another. I thought I had a vague memory of that name, but I couldn't place any of her work. You don't forget a name like Saffron Segovia. A wunderkind, Joseph said. You must have run into her at literary events, though maybe you traveled in different circles. She was a bit more outre than you. Hung out with writers, artists like Sophie Calle, Paul Auster, David Shields. I believe I met her at a party once. I probably had met her at some conference or another. I'd met pretty much everyone at a party or a conference once. All I had were vague recollections of most of them. There were so many, too many, and most of them were here in this cafe. But Joseph always made me feel as though I were the least well-read writer on the planet. She struck me as a bit self-obsessed. Well, she was so young when she died, Joseph said. At least 30 years our junior. Did you see the movie they made out of Anatomy of a Mass Extinction? Shortened to Extinction for the film. I nodded. Can you believe she ended up here at first? A death unrecognized by the literary establishment, but she's universally revered now. We used to sit together all the time and chat, just like we're doing now. She and Winterhaven? Hoven, he said. Winterhoven. Your work reminds me of early Segovia, he said, before she found her voice, after her death. You said Winterhoven and Segovia wrote something that changed their literary fortunes after they died. In theory, I could do this too? If you think it was difficult getting noticed when you were alive, look around you, Joseph said. There are multitudes. Even tapping one key on Kafka's typewriter would be a miracle for you. When he seemed to notice my expression, he added, for anyone among us. For me, the pleasures are now vicarious. Here, all pleasures are vicarious, which makes them less dangerous. The sooner you understand this, the happier you'll be here. Read, write, rediscover yourself. Think of this as a never-ending writing retreat. Think of your life as simply a promising movie with a disappointing ending, but not worth another worry. Any other life can now replace your own. All you have to do is let go and imagine. Relax. How I hated that word. How unrelaxing the word relax is. When my first wife and I were going through Lamaze classes together before our first child was born, the coach told me when my wife was in labor never to use that word. Instead, I should say release, which is a far more relaxing word. Release, release, release. Oh, how I wanted that, though it seemed impossible. The Eternal One is whimsical, and his answer to every unanswerable question is inevitably because I can. Joseph said this in a deep voice, obviously quoting. Blake, come now. You don't recognize your own words? That's a direct quote from your Pushcart Prize nominated short story, Another Harmless Poison, one of your best. The story actually won a Pushcart, I reminded him. It wasn't just nominated. His expression, a wince and a slight tilt of the head, read, my mistake, but who cares? True, if I had had the opportunity, I would have burned the story. It felt so dated, as though someone else entirely had written it. It felt unfelt, inauthentic, like most of my work, pale imitations of others, though the saddest part was that I hadn't realized I was imitating anyone else. I didn't hate everything I had ever written, merely most of it, and hate was too strong a word. I was disappointed in my writings, the way a child who has only been given love and opportunities disappoints a parent with their lack of direction and conviction. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
So I have a whole page worth of questions here, but I feel like, I mean, the first thing I really want to know is like, where did this come from? I mean, the book is, it's so many things, you know?
Yeah.
It's got all this nonfiction in it. It's, on the one hand, really depressing if you're a writer. I heard Brian like groaning at the death scene there. But it's also fun. You know, it's making fun of things, but it's very sincere, and it's in Prague, and there's this obsession with Kafka, and it's about the AWP and how weird writers are. And so how did all those things come into your brain and form a project?
I don't know. I mean, my friend David Shields, who I mentioned there, said he thinks it's the book I was sort of meant, that I was dying, as it were, to write. And I think to some degree that's true. I mean, it came from a mashup of various things. You know, I was in Prague with my daughters, and they wanted to go to the Kafka Museum, and I've always loved Kafka. I'm not quite as obsessed with Kafka as my character is, but he had to be that obsessed,
Sure.
you know. And I was at the Kafka Museum with them. I actually didn't really want to go because it just seemed like another sort of marketing ploy to get tourists in Prague, you know, and to pay money, you know. But I went and I found it really fascinating. And there was this, it was mostly just photographs and things on the wall, explaining the photographs. And one of them was a photograph of the Yiddish theater. And it's mentioned how much Kafka loved the Yiddish theater. And he was from a very sort of upstanding German Jewish family, and his father hated the Yiddish theater and hated all
Which is probably why Kafka.
exactly, yeah. So my great grandmother Hannah was indeed in the Yiddish theater, and I just had this momentary thought. I wonder what if they met, you know, and I didn't know about it. And so for the longest time, I just mulled over this idea, and I thought, how am I going to write this? Is this going to be a historical novel or what? And then I just had this idea, just kind of popped in my head, of the Cafe of Minor Authors, and I thought, well, I'll make it a kind of autofiction, a kind of memoir that really is an aspect of me, a kind of exaggeration of me, but that sort of explores this sort of family dynamic too, and this obsession with Kafka. Because I've always also loved time travel stories, and so it was really, really fun to write about Prague in 1911 and 1912.
Yeah. It's really, you know, there's a description of the book on the back, and typically you see in a book, you know, 2 women travel on a train through Ireland. That's the plot. You know, and yours is like, it takes them half the back jacket to describe how to encapsulate this thing. I mean, it's speculative history, it's literary fantasy, it's satire, I mean, do you feel you're skewering the writers' lives, writers' communities, even in an affectionate sort of way?
Yeah, I mean, in an affectionate way, because I certainly include myself in this. The sense of insecurity and vanity and arrogance that writers have, and it's arrogance is necessary when you're young to sort of get that sort of momentum going, I think. But then there's that. I had a lot of fun with the sort of exchanges that these writers have. These very self-promoting writers, even in eternity, they're still handing out business cards and asking if any opportunities crop up to keep them in mind and things like that. So, and then I had also fun with it wasn't just about writers, of course, as you say. I really also was very interested in that moment in history, in terms of the Yiddish theater and the Jewish Prague.
Yeah.
Because that's more or less gone.
Yeah.
And so that really interested me as well, and just the whole idea of artistic dreaming and promise when you're young. How when you're young I made my great-grandmother a kind of ingenue character who is also, filled up with these sort of dreams, of these grandiose dreams as well, but they don't match her talent or lack of talent.
Did you have any real information about the great-grandmother? I mean, photos? Did you have family records?
Yeah, I mean, my great-grandmother Hannah, though she died decades before I was born, was as much a presence in my life as my sister or mother or anyone. She was this very strong woman who left Lithuania when she was, I think, early 20s to escape an arranged marriage, and joined her brother in where he lived, and the brother promptly took all her money and left his wife and her with nothing, and went to join the military. And she had to get a job sewing buttons on waterproof coats, which made her fingers bleed, and all this is true.
Yeah.
And I recount it in the book, and even the part where she was in such despair that she was about to jump into the river.
Yeah.
When an amazing thing happened. These were all stories in my in growing up, and what happened was, as I was writing the last scenes of the book, I was cleaning out the basement, and my mother passed away in 2004, and we had a lot of her papers. She was a writer too, and I was paying my then 15-year-old daughter to help me sort through these. And we were on the sun porch, and she said to me, "Hey, is this important?" And she handed me this document I had never seen in my life, which was my great-grandmother Hannah's sort of description of all of these events that I had been writing about as told to her daughter Augusta, or my Aunt Gus. And I even have that in because it fits so perfectly, and it corroborated all of these family stories, and it was just one of those things where it was the perfect moment.
Yeah.
I mean, I think every writer has those kinds of
You
things
find something
at the right moment.
Yeah, at the right moment. There's a great phrase, I can't remember who said it, that when a writer is born into a family, the family is finished. Which I always like. Because my sister
That's
once made
wonderful.
me these fake business cards that said, Julie Schumacher, writing about other people's unusual families. Like trying to disassociate yourself.
Funny.
And so I'm thinking, in here you've got all this stuff about Hannah, you've got David Shields, who's your pal,
Yeah.
and he's, very interesting in terms of fiction, nonfiction. And would it matter to you that an average reader not knowing you would assume Hannah's fiction, does it matter if we read all of it as fiction? It's called an after autobiography.
No, it doesn't matter at all.
Mm-hmm.
People.
Because to you, you did that research, and Hannah's real. You know her stories, and
Yeah, I mean, I don't really care. I think a lot of people do assume that a lot of it's real, and a lot of it is real, you know. More people thought it was nonfiction, I mean, except for the afterlife stuff, you know, thought it was nonfiction than fiction. And
the Cafe of Minor Authors, a sort of purgatory for dead writers. You can never get out of it, and nobody will really ever care much about your work. I mean, it is like a literary hell, the perfect order.
Yeah. Well, it was fun to do that because, and I think that just came from being at too many AWP conferences. So, but yeah, I actually don't mind whether people. I like it when people ask me, you know, is it true that your great grandmother knew Kafka? And I really always want to say, I'm not going to tell you. I actually did say that to my friend, the writer Eileen Pollock. She read it and she said, "Did your great grandmother know Kafka?" And I said, "I'm not going to tell you, Eileen." And she wrote back and she said, "You stink." She was so angry at me.
I want you to talk about the comedy versus depressing material, because I always find that interesting too. That people typically think comedy is just solely funny, but
Yeah.
I think it's more interesting when it's not. And there are, it's overall kind of a depressing premise that he's going to be stuck in this place, and he dies in this awful, humiliating way.
Right. Well, I mean, don't you think? I mean, I think anyway that the best comedy is the most honest, brutally honest. You know, I love brutally honest comedy. You know, it just seems to me that that it is this sort of mixture of sort of shocking, shocking honesty that just sort of makes you laugh because it seems true. So I with any kind of memoir, I've always made it my point to be as honest as possible, and so to let out all of those feelings in a way that could seem depressing was for me the only way to go, you know. But I don't find it ultimately depressing. I actually find it a weirdly hopeful book in the end. Weirdly, stressing that word, yeah. But yeah, I find that for me, comedy is honesty.
Is that true with? I mean, you've written travel writing, you've done short stories, you've done memoir, you've done novels, you've done all kinds of different. You're in the Fox versus Hedgehog category. You're definitely in the Fox camp of writers doing all over different sorts of stuff. And do you think that issue of honesty is true regardless?
Yeah, I do. I think that I regret one or two of my books that I feel were not quite as honest as they should have
In
been.
what way? How were they?
I mean, I think they weren't sort of really tracking who I was emotionally at the time in a way that I think that you can write in a self-deceiving way, and when you do that, I think a reader can kind of sniff that out.
Yeah.
You know, and so I don't know how you feel about that.
No, it makes sense to me. I'm trying to think of. I inherently know what you mean, but I'm trying to think of examples of it. Other books I've read where I think, oh, is this writer being not quite honest with me emotionally? It's hard to pinpoint.
I know I've read some. They're not coming to me right now, but I've definitely read books where I think, oh, this writer is not.
And is it like the phrasing? What is it?
Well, it's usually the way they position themselves and how they sort of wear themselves on the page. If they're sort of positioning themselves in a way that feels a little defensive or feels like they're only saying things that are going to get a laugh or that are going to make the reader sympathize with them, then I always say that a writer should be a hero of their own memoir, and so I've read some things that I felt were
number of times. I kept circling it in my copy. One point, I think he's talking to Joseph. These were the questions that dogged me, ones I could never fully answer. They seemed akin to that famous and unanswerable question, why do you write? And again, that comes up throughout the novel, and I thought, is that one of the things you're investigating here? Why do this? I mean, your character is often frustrated, horribly frustrated by everything he's trying to write.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that sort of why write has always been something that has been a question for writers. I mean, early on I read that famous George Orwell essay, Why I Write.
And Joan Didion. The same name. Yep.
Right. And so it's something that writers think about because it's not just a matter of writing for posterity. You have to have that sense of obsession and drive and whatever, but at the same time, you don't know how it's going to be received in the world or for how long it's going to be received in the world. And so that was sort of, I wrote the book in part to sort of try to answer some of those questions. There's that, I'm not a big Charles Bukowski fan, but I do have this quote in there where he, which I really like about, he says, there's no losing in writing, and he talks about, or he writes about, even just writing itself as its reward, and that you'll, even if you don't make a mark, you'll sort of be honored in hell or whatever in the sort of Bukowski fashion.
Sure,
But it's actually a really good quote, and I was just talking to another writer about it recently, and how it's something that just the act is a kind of defiant, wonderful act itself.
Yeah. I used to take a sort of survey in classes when I taught, and I would ask, I had a mixed genre class one time, poets, fiction writers, nonfiction writers, and I said, how much of the time that you write are you enjoying the writing process? And one or two people said, never. And I thought, never?
Yeah.
It seemed like the poets were very high on the scale. They were 80, 90%.
That's great.
They were having fun for whatever reason. The prosers were less content, I suppose. They still wanted to do it. They had the obsession,
Right.
but they were often very frustrated.
Yeah, well,
And I kept thinking, what percentage, how low do you go before you give it up?
Really?
When do you stop?
well, there was that famous, I think it was Dorothy Parker who said that famous quote, I hate writing, but I love having written.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of writers have that, where they like having written. But for me, I'd say, I don't know, somewhere in there, book 7, 8, whatever, I stopped enjoying the process somewhat, and then I kind of rediscovered it in the last few years, I'd say, and that really has nothing to do with the reception of the book or anything else. I kind of rediscovered why I was writing in the first place, and I hope that doesn't stop.
Yeah.
Because I do think at some point you have to enjoy it.
I'll just ask you one more question and see if anybody else has one. I'm thinking of those, the column in the New York Times Book Review where they ask writers, who would you invite to your literary dinner party, living or dead, if you could Shakespeare, whoever it might be, because would Kafka be on your...
And Broad. I would want to invite Broad too.
Oh, yeah. The two of them together.
Yeah, I'd want the two of them together because I think they were, and I was going to also say about humor again, that one thing, I'm not the person who first said this by any means, but Kafka is always seen as this sort of depressing, odd guy, and he was actually very funny, and he would read his work to his friends, and they'd bust a gut laughing, the trial, and someone, I think it was Philip Roth, who called him the greatest sit-down comic ever, and in his Roth-like way.
That's great.
Yeah, and so I would have Kafka, Broad, writer who was who died when I was 7, but he was the main editor and translator of the Nobel laureate Isaac Bashevis Singer, and I knew Singer when I was much younger, and so I'd have my father and Singer, and I would probably have Borges.
Oh yeah.
And I once sat across a table in a cafe in Bloomington, Indiana, when I was 19 years old, across from Borges and the person who was guiding him, and I was so terrified that I couldn't say a word to him, and so I'd want to get that chance back. And there's someone, a writer who he always writes about, whose name slips my mind, another Argentinian writer who was his pal, who I would, so I'd have those 6 to dinner.
That'd be great party.
Yeah, it would be. And you'd be welcome to.
Oh, I'd be afraid to say anything.
Well, we could talk.
So I wonder if anybody else has a question.
Are there any writers that you wanted to include in Oblivion, but for whatever reason maybe there wasn't enough space, or you thought they were too popular, that you had to leave them out?
Oh, in the cafe?
Yes.
Oh, so that's so interesting. There was one well-known, so I didn't have only writers who weren't famous in their lifetime in the cafe. Some of them were just really sort of self-involved writers who were well-known, but I didn't name them. I thought of it. There was one in particular I thought of, who just seemed really self-obsessed, and I just decided, no, that's nasty. I don't want to do that. So I just sort of mentioned in passing that there were these writers, and so that there were some writers who, most of the writers are writers who are who I either invented or are composites or whatever. But I did this fun thing, which I love it if you go and check it out. I did this really fun website, really elaborate. It's called, it's the Cafe of Minor Authors, and if you just put it into the URL oblivion.cafe, it'll come up, and it even has, it's just very interactive, and it even has at the back of the cafe, I mean, you can interact with the different writers. Some of them are real writers, and including this writer that Franz Kafka hated, but is actually a very good poet. But there's at the back of the cafe is a wall of exceptionally minor authors, and exceptionally minor,
Distinguished by how minor they are.
yeah, and what's fun is I used all computer-generated photos. I was able to sculpt my so it's these portraits. They look very real, but they're all computer-generated. Yeah, so check it out.
I'll be a little cheeky. How about Kafka, the story of your great grandmother? Are you going to tell us, or no? That's fine if you don't.
Oh wow! I'll write it in the book. I'm kidding. No. They did know each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you sure? I mean, they could have met.
They could have. Yeah, they could have. I mean, I don't know. She didn't write about it.
Yeah, there's no evidence that they knew.
There's no evidence.
But it's always possible.
I thought I would try.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to. I mean, it's hard to say. There's so many gaps.
I mean, how big a city was Prague at that time? It was probably a pretty large city.
Yeah, definitely. And the Jewish population tended to sort of mill together. So, yeah, possibly. Other questions?
With these writers, do you explore like what kinds of topics they chose to write about, and whether they were important or trivial, and how they kind of got into what they got into?
In some cases, yeah.
Because it would seem that would have something to do with perhaps with there being minor writers. I don't know, or it could be connected.
Well,
But maybe they didn't.
there's this one writer in there who, so I have this one sort of Kafka, and my protagonist goes there at one point with Yosef, and there's this one really dour guy who everyone is shunning, and he is someone who knew Kafka, and he was at one time a really famous writer. He's a real character named Johannes Schlaf. And Johannes Schlaf was very famous at one point in Germany, and then he just sort of, I don't know, kind of just lost it in many ways and started writing these really quirky, strange books, that one of which was called Professor Plossman and the Phenomenon of Sunspots. And I mean, you got to pick up a book like that, right? You know, and it's all, and he's trying in the 20th century to overturn Copernicus. He basically decided, because of sunspots, that in fact the sun revolves around the Earth. I mean, and Kafka visited him once or twice, and said he made terrible coffee. We know this from his diary. But you know, Kafka was actually a really nice guy and didn't say bad things about most people, and most writers, and would sit through the most boring reading ever just for one perfect line, you know. But Johannes Schlaf later became a Nazi. When Hitler came to power, he was one of these signatories of writers who pledged allegiance to the Nazis. So I give him his comeuppance in Oblivion, and make him especially, and he's on the wall of exceptionally minor authors too. Yeah, with a real photo of him.
How did you get that how did you manage to make the website?
Well, I had some funds from my university, and I just said, let's go to town, and I got this great web developer, and it's the best website I've ever had. It's really fun.
It's amazing.
And there's even a contest in it, which is fun. I did a pseudo, so there's Kafka's typewriter. There's a store in Iowa City where I used to teach, and we still have a house, and there's a store called Artifacts, and one day, maybe a year ago, or not even a year ago, I was going into Artifacts, and I saw behind the counter the exact model of Kafka's typewriter that for sale, you know, and so I just had to get it. So we have a replica of Kafka's typewriter on the website, and a Kafka-like or Kafka-esque first sentence, and we invite people to write up to 250 words to sort of get the beginning of the story.
And the typeface and some of the design in here was
The drawings are actually Kafka's drawings. The chapter headings all have Kafka's drawings.
What inspires you to write novels?
What inspires me right now? I don't know. I think, as Julie was saying, you know, I am sort of a fox in that way, that I tend to love to go from farm to farm, as it were, and I will write for a while in one genre, and then I'll get an idea that really feels. But this book, as Julie was saying, is not just purely a novel. It's as much memoir as it is novel. So it fits into that sort of somewhat trendy category, autofiction, which has been popular in the last few years.
yeah.
But I really do feel it's a sort of but what makes me interested in novels is just the sort of imaginative leaps that I can make in a novel, and exploring character and building worlds that don't exist, and all of those things.
I agree, it's fun.
Yeah.
Is there a next book in the process?
Yeah, I'm actually working on a new novel, and doing some research for it this summer. find this, but I find that when I work on a novel, I'm be very excited in the beginning, and then I get to about page 100, and then I just flounder a bit. I sort of call it the humps of the novel.
Yeah.
Do you ever feel that?
Oh, I feel like I get to page 100 for the ninth time.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and then,
that's what I
then you can get another wind in your sails if you're almost done. But
exactly.
the 2/3 point is deadly.
I know, it's
Yeah,
terrible. I don't know if you'll feel that way as well, but
Terrible.
it's just, it's this, so when and I'm at that point with this novel right now, where I was so excited about it, my agent was excited about it, I can envision it, and I'm 100 pages into it, but now I'm at the point where I'm a little stumped. So,
You need that key.
I do, yeah.
Yeah, you gotta find the key.
Yeah.
Great.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you very
That's
much.
fun.